Good morning, it's Tuesday the 24th of October in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Hamas frees 2 more hostages from Gaza as the US sends more forces to the Middle East. Bond bears beware. The billionaire investors Bill Ackman and Bill Gross abandon their short position on US Treasuries. Plus, Bloomberg's list of 25 UK startups to watch, ranging from the content platform OnlyFans to a wearable brain scanner company. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Hamas has freed 2 more hostages from the Gaza Strip. The 2 elderly women were released to the International Committee of the Red Cross, while more than 200 others are still being held by militants. The move is giving some Israeli officials cause to rethink the scope of a planned ground invasion of Gaza. Bloomberg's Michael Heath says the releases are helping diplomatic calls for restraint.
This movement of people coming out encourages leaders to encourage Israel to engage and to hold off in terms of the ground invasion until they can get more people out. Qatar and Egypt negotiated this release. So at this stage, we're still waiting on the ground operation, and obviously there's still talks going on with the hostages. President Joe Biden has said once the hostages are released, we can start talking about a ceasefire.
Our reporter Michael Heath pointing out that US President Joe Biden appeared to suggest a ceasefire could be discussed if all hostages were released. Now, one of the 2 women freed in Gaza was a British citizen. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak told MPs that Hamas must be held accountable.
Hamas is not only a threat to Israel, but to many others across the region. All the leaders I met agree that this is a watershed moment. It's time to set the region on a better path.
The Prime Minister also announced more aid would be sent to Gaza. Only a fraction of normal supplies are being allowed into the territory. The EU's chief diplomat, Josep Borrell, says aid is his top priority.
We have to start thinking of how to revive the political process. But the priority at that moment is to make humanitarian support going into Gaza.
Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, joining the international calls for restraint. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, meanwhile, reiterating that Israel must protect civilians and abide by humanitarian law, even as it has the right to defend itself. Some of the bond market's most prominent bears are saying the rout in US Treasuries has gone too far. Pershing Square founder Bill Ackman says he's unwound his bet against US government bonds. Bloomberg's Sonali Basak explains why.
The reason he is taking off this short position now is he says there's too much risk in the world to remain short bonds at current long-term rates. The economy is slowing faster than recent data suggests. So that implies worries about a further bid in the bond market, perhaps a haven bid as the economy starts to slow down.
As Sonali Basak notes there, Ackman's scepticism on the health of the US economy stands in contrast to surprisingly strong recent economic data. PIMCO co-founder Bill Gross agrees. He's predicting a recession by the end of the year and says he's buying short-dated interest rate futures. The Bank of Japan has announced an unscheduled bond buying operation, the 5th since tweaking its yield curve control back in July. The traders are testing the central bank's reserves ahead of next week's policy meeting. The BOJ's loose monetary policy is also contributing to the depreciation of the yen, which is the worst performing G10 currency this year. Chevron is buying a piece of the world's largest oil discovery of the past decade. The oil major agreeing to buy the energy company Hess for $53 billion. Chevron CEO Mike Wirth says the deal doesn't change the company's green commitments.
I don't think you should read this as a lack of commitment to the energy transition, but we need to invest in what the world runs on today. This makes us a stronger producer. It takes 2 great American companies and brings them together, which is good for national security and economic security. And we're committed, both of our companies are committed to a lower carbon energy system.
Wirth's mega deal is the second in the last few weeks for the oil industry. Exxon threw $58 billion into acquiring Pioneer, a sign both US giants see fossil fuels in the energy mix for decades to come. And the head of Virgin Atlantic Airways says the war between Israel and Hamas is deterring travel across portions of the Middle East. Speaking to Bloomberg, the carrier's head said the impact on travel may extend beyond the specific flight restrictions recently put in place.
The situation in Israel, of course, after the atrocities of October the 7th is still unpredictable. So I think right now, the major impact has been, of course, people are now flying into Israel, and because of that, they're now flying also to the area, into Jordan, into Egypt, into other locations.
The warning from Shai Weiss of Virgin Atlantic underscores uncertainty in the air travel market after the conflict led carriers to suspend services to Tel Aviv earlier this month. And if you want to hear that full interview, you can find it on the Bloomberg Talks podcast. All of our most important conversations in one place. Let's turn back, though, to the latest that we've heard from the Middle East. Those 2 more hostages released from Gaza, more than 200 others, of course, still being held by Hamas after they were captured during the October 7th attack on southern Israel. Meanwhile, the US President Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu speaking again by phone, discussing US deployments to the region, among other issues. Let's get the latest now from Tel Aviv and go to Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who's there for us this morning. Oliver, good morning. What is the latest on events there overnight?
Yes, as you mentioned, another 2 hostages freed, which is a meaningful development. 2 elderly women taken from a kibbutz about 2 kilometers from the sort of border fence with Gaza. We understand their husbands in their 80s are still being held. And this was brokered by Qatar, yes, but also we understand that Egypt was part of this conversation. And as you say, Benjamin Netanyahu and Biden spoke about this on the phone. There is also the question of aid, which the U.S. has been very active in. And we understand that 35 trucks crossed into Gaza yesterday, which would be the greatest number to have crossed since the beginning of this crisis. However, still somewhat short of what the UN says will be, really minimum of 100 a day in order to make meaningful progress there.
Okay, let's look then at some of the efforts being made diplomatically and what hope that might give to the more than 200 hostages that still remain captured in Gaza. As you say, 2 more hostages being added to the 2 others that were freed over the weekend.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to get a read on that, only because everyone who is involved in this is all through back channels, and they're not really wanting to reveal a lot of the information that they're getting. We know that it is a top priority for basically every leader who has any citizens being held, certainly for the Israelis, certainly for the United States, and we know that Qatar is playing a very key role in those discussions. Again, the question also is, how does this bear on the potential ground offensive, which we had been expecting for a long period of time, and now whose, I think, nature and scope is certainly being recalibrated or reconsidered on a very active basis from much of the reporting that we're doing, partially and as a function of the hostages, but also probably as a function of, the international view of the conflict, and as well, how the Israelis, how much they can achieve basically from the skies. And again, the bombardment has very much continued into Gaza and southern Lebanon.
We've also, on the diplomatic front, Oliver, had the latest first comments, from China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. What should we read into what we heard from him?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. This first comments there, really the first contact at that level between the Israelis and the Chinese since the conflict began. There has been some discussion from Wang Yi with other foreign ministers in the region, but this is the highest level of contact we've had since the beginning of the conflict. And really there was the notion that every nation has a right to self-defense, but there was also sympathy espoused for both the Israelis and Palestinians, and really saying that the number one interest needs to be to protect civilians. However, we had also heard from a readout from a call with the Saudi foreign minister between Wang Yi and the Saudis, saying that basically the Israelis' actions had gone beyond self-defense and it needs to stop its collective punishment of the people of Gaza, is what he had said there. And Xi Jinping himself has called for an immediate ceasefire.
Oliver, a word too on what we heard from Israel's central bank as well, which has been looking at the effect of the war on the economic outlook.
Completely. And so we had a rate decision yesterday where rates were left unchanged, but we also had a cut to the GDP forecast. Originally, Israel had expected to grow 3% this year, 3% next year. They reduced that to 2.3% this year and 2.8% next year. And again, they've said that is if things remain relatively contained, which is a big if. And I can tell you from just being here for the last 2 weeks, just in terms of activity on the ground, many, many, many businesses have been closed, very few people in circulation. So certainly eventually there will be economic consequences, which is really a discussion that has taken the back burner with the primacy on the military. And a word on, the Gaza economic situation, I think it's almost impossible to calculate the damage that's being done there.
Okay, Oliver Crook in Tel Aviv, thank you very much for updating us on the story there this morning. Well, now turning to other news, Bloomberg has published its list of 25 British startups to watch, ranging from the digital bank Monzo to a wearable brain scanner maker. They've been picked time at Bloomberg's Technology Summit taking place in London today. Amy Thompson, who leads our team of technology reporters in London, joins us now for more. Amy, talk us through how you managed to devise this list. What were the key factors that made a startup stand out for you?
Hey, morning. Yeah. So we are looking at companies who are doing something genuinely innovative, companies from all over the UK. The diversity of where they were coming from and the founder's background and the sorts of things that they were working on was really important. And we were looking for companies that could really show us that they had gained some traction with customers or investors. And, when we put the call out back in the summer, I wasn't confident necessarily that we were going to get this, because it was such a grim period for the tech industry globally. That was back when we were seeing sort of all the job cuts from the big tech companies. Companies that were able to raise money were doing down rounds. But we were really, really pleasantly surprised. We got more than 1,500 applications in the end, and a lot of them were really, really impressive. And
look, there are some names in there people will know and some they don't.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got some big brands like Monzo. We've got some high street brands like LV. And then we've got a lot of really interesting, very sort of scientific companies, university spinouts. You mentioned the wearable brain scanner, Circa Magnetics. We've got genomics. We've got a company that's making chips out of graphene, which is a really interesting sort of material science story. We've got Chemify, which is digitizing chemistry to do molecule discovery. So we've got a lot of really, really interesting companies.
Now, you mentioned sort of the backdrop to this being perhaps not the most optimistic. British politicians very keen to talk up the UK's potential to be a tech hub. But what sort of trends did you uncover in these startups to watch?
I think, like I said, we see a lot of strength out of the universities in the UK. We saw a lot of great ideas that came from labs in Cambridge and Oxford and Leicester and Nottingham. So it seems like one of the big stories out of this is that the universities in the UK are really great incubators for some interesting companies.
What about the challenges, Amy, that they face in fundraising, though? It's something we often hear about companies leaving the UK to go to usually the US to raise more money.
Yeah, I mean, it's not been a great year for fundraising. I remember talking to VCs last Christmas, and a lot of them were saying we're going to be really cautious this year, and that has definitely played out. The last PitchBook report I saw said that funding was down something like 58% in the first half of the year. And, similarly, exits dropped. We didn't see the same kind of, IPOs and sales. Though it does seem like there is some cautious optimism for next year.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond. Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com. Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa device. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.